We'll just go straight on. I'd just like to introduce Philip Thalis, who many of you already know, of course, but Philip's a registered architect and principal of Hill Thalis Architecture and Urban Projects. Founded in 1992, Hill Thalis is recognised for its design skills and independent standpoint. This is, I should say, something that Philip's written, but I couldn't possibly write it better because I think it's that recognition for adopting and maintaining an independent standpoint that, in fact, the practice is absolutely renowned for and recognised for. And in taking that pretty independent stance, he's also managed to win 40 competitions, commendations and awards. So, I mean, the combination of the two is, I think, unusual. Now, Philip actively promotes the culture of architecture and city making, combining the direction of the practice with teaching, research, conference papers and public lectures. So, Philip.
Thanks very much, Rod, and thanks everyone for coming. Well, I think like Helen, we're all great travellers, and whereas Helen went for a year, I'm just going to talk about, very briefly as an introduction, a city I knew nothing about that I went to for 3 days. And the city is Busan in Korea. Has anyone been there? Had anyone heard of it? No, I hadn't heard of it. It's the second biggest city in Korea, and it has some 3.5 million people. It has the 5th biggest port in the world, which is currently in here and has just been relocated to that big, that is all Newport. It fits, as you can see, this is Sydney, it fits sort of in the eastern suburbs, which says something about the way that Sydney sprawl. And it has, like Sydney, like the Bays precinct, it has an absolutely vibrant working harbour, perhaps in contradistinction to Sydney, which is for the first time being opened as public space. It has a superlative site. We are spoilt with our superlative site, but we're not the only city in the world with superlative waterfront sites, including fantastic beaches. So 3 days, I was tacked on the end of a holiday to Japan, which I also knew nothing about. And here's the site. So you could call it their Barangaroo, you could call it their Battery Park City, you could call it a number of things, very similar size, landfill, spanning around that central bay, and still partly working harbour. But what you can see as you scan around there is virtually every centimetre of the harbour front is working harbour. It was a very interesting jury with 6 Korean professors of architecture, urban design, landscape, and 2 fly-ins or blow-ins. We were treated very well. One from Case Christensen, and someone from the office is speaking next Wednesday. And this is standing on the site, and I guess, as we all know, the waterfront is an extraordinary attractor as cities turn themselves towards their harbour. It has a real working harbour. They actually make ships, for example, and they have lots of stuff being made. It is dirty, vibrant, incredibly visually interesting, I'm sure polluted and the rest. And it certainly captivated our jury. You couldn't stop them looking at the working harbour, and maybe that's a sort of reverse tourism thing. And it's not redundant in public space. In fact, this is the only place I've been able to find on Google where there's any contact between public domain and the waterfront. And so the competition was a new start for Busan and how the city could gain those trophies of public life and public space and fantastic design. And I must say the competition was extraordinarily well judged. I think that the Dutch architect from KCAP, Ruud Gietma, was, I guess we were perhaps a bit apprehensive at first, and from the first scheme on, we saw the 7 finalists. We were just blown away by how much work, how serious they were, the quality of their thinking and presentation and focus. Was really quite astounding, and the sheer quantity of work concentrated within an existing master plan, which was the weakest link, but on the public space. This is actually the winner. You can access it through their website. And we just downloaded this as the 2nd and 3rd schemes. Incredible clarity and quality of design was a real eye-opener, and also in these schemes, how it connected back into the city, had to negotiate both an enormous railway and a 14-lane road, and obviously some parallels with Helen's example. And some other schemes that also, this is also one of the best schemes that connected back into the city in a very skillful way and proposed an entire new public domain, which is not only the foreshore, new cultural facilities which weren't part of their scope, and a new canal which was a given, and then a retention of part of the historic port. It's a very new city, it's only 140 years old. And so here's the view from my hotel as I woke up on my first morning in Busan, and I looked across at the site. That I could understand. But in later days, something over here also caught my eye. And on the last afternoon, I had some time free, so I took a taxi with a map and said, well, just take me around over all these bridges, and I want to see what all these things are. And I guess you saw what you might miscategorise or characterise the Asian city as sort of places of where perhaps you'd call them favoured treatment. Now, I haven't had a chance to research these. I don't know if that's what it is. But it sure looks different to everybody else, and it sure looks like someone gave them a leg up, doesn't it? So, you know, these things are what we associate a lot with the contemporary Asian city. And this is the one actually, here it is, under construction here, and tiny little hovels at the back, built by the Great China investment arm. And boy, this is a title you could use again in Sydney, isn't it? Bay Life-based city. I'm sure that one will come around again. And what a surprise. Here are these 3 trophy towers just completely just dumped on the foreshore. I think you know where I'm going. So this is, I guess, what happens when we don't get public leadership on the city and we only think of the city as business and the self-interest of business. So I just want to concentrate and just bear with me while I just go back a little bit into memory lane on the competition that we did, and that Helen certainly was one of the judges for our competition winning scheme for what was then East Darling Harbour, where we actually sought to make it part of the city rather than a place apart, and make the whole city better for the presence of Barangaroo rather than to have trophy windfall profit for the selected clique of landlords. We sought a strategy that made the entire foreshore ours, the people of Sydney, and our visitors. One plan orchestrating a multitude of projects. I'm not going to put it all in, don't worry. A plan based on a public domain, and I think you could have that in contradistinction to the current plan, which has no public domain and no streets whatsoever, a couple of mean driveways over a basement car park, a couple of porte cocheres, one of the worst parks ever proposed in Sydney, which is in the back of the casino and the apartment towers, not on the foreshore at all or connected in any way, and a scheme that also proposed public buildings, community buildings, buildings for our society, and again, they're conspicuously absent from the current plan. And what we said, perhaps naively, but I would say optimistically to the jury, was one plan, hundreds of elements, authentic diversity, the work of many hands, a robust project. We hoped the project was Sydney-proof, and we were wrong. But we didn't. We still put the project forward in complete optimism, and why I'm very keen to keep speaking up about this project, not because of the merits or faults of our scheme, but more about the proposition and the values that it enshrined. We weren't scared of big towers, big commercial towers, but the whole foreshore had to be public. It's actually our land. What we wanted is the area to be broken up into blocks by public streets, a new great edge street, just as Macquarie Street served us so well on the eastern side of the city. These people would get all the commercial advantage of a great address, but we would get the park in perpetuity, and they'd be held back behind the line of the street, because the streets are the most critical piece of city building that you can have. And of course, what we emphasise, as I'm emphasising now, is the public interest in the scheme. And our conception of the city was a series of layers in the foreground to the harbour. And so the first layer would be the public promenade, the second layer would be the park, the third layer would be the street. They could be accentuated by public art and the like. And then the fourth layer would be the buildings which sit in the foreground of the city as the towers climb the hill. Instead, what we have is what I've playfully characterised as buffheads hogging the front row, where they get all the advantage and everyone else gets the disadvantage. But let's not just take it as an image. Let's look at the nature of the deal. And I could have put in a lot more slides, but Rod's always emphasising how we have too much information. There isn't an example that you can actually cite in the centre of Sydney going back to 1788, where a single landowner has been given more than 7 hectares of prime city land, in particular more than 7 hectares of waterfront land, in particular 7 hectares where they've been able to throw out whatever rules were in place and write their own to their own advantage, particularly 7 hectares which is public land. Why is it good enough today? Why is it good enough in Sydney at all, ever? And of course, just next to so-called East Darling Harbour, Barangaroo, we have Darling Harbour relived, and Rod and I had the misadventure of experiencing Darling Harbour, very appropriately in 1984. You might recall seeing the exhibition of the new Darling Harbour. Did any of you see that? It was on over Christmas, I believe, for 2 weeks in the foyer of Parliament House. So you all missed it, did you? I think I was the only one there when I went. But here we go again. Have we learnt nothing? Darling Harbour, 1984. Here we go again, tabula rasa. We might have got it wrong once, but what's the excuse for getting it wrong twice? And so here's the drawing, which you can download from the website, this sort of improbable mix of facilities, but look at also the contrast, because this project, for all of its abundant faults, was a public project on public land with genuine public facilities. Here they become commercial facilities and the whole thing is outsourced to the government's seemingly favourite developer. We talk about a global city. I reckon we're a company town. I reckon we're the bastion of provincialism, and I don't think that's good enough. And the disjunction between the spiel and the public interest is quite acute. Rod, as part of this Festival of Urbanism, is looking more broadly at the Bays Precinct, and I guess you'd want to think about the mistakes we've made and the things that we could perhaps do right, and I'd add in Helen's proviso about the Olympic site as being something we haven't done as right as we could have done. Why is there a Bays Precinct at all? Because, like Barangaroo, like Darling Harbour, like Walsh Bay, there was foresight in government in the early years of the 19th century. This is the Sydney Harbour Trust's plan for, or vision, or whatever you want to call it. It's actually a plan because it's more than just a statement. It actually is a physical plan for the Port of Sydney. And the reason we have been able to build all these projects over the next 100 years is that government had the foresight to either resume or reclaim and then to plan these pieces of the city in not as holistic a way as they could have, but nonetheless reasonably holistic. And so, for instance, Hickson Road is part of it. Pyramid Road is actually part of the main port road. There's actually a bit of it here. Maybe thankfully they didn't do this bit, but nonetheless there's a structure that is open and available, and this project is fairly contemporaneous with the goods line, which is now the trams line, which was built in 1916, though they also sensibly had what they called a subaqueous tunnel connecting back the point of Balmain so that you got a loop. And transport really should be the key, I think, to the Bays Precincts. You've had some how could you call them, mouthpieces of the development industry saying that height is actually the key to the Bays Precinct. I think every intelligent city in the world knows that public transport is the key to a place and its importance in Sydney. And the reason that you'd put it up is in terms of the Metropolitan Plan, and we thankfully now have one, thanks to Rod and Pat and a few other advocates of that in planning. It doesn't actually show the Bays Precinct. That plan I just showed you 2 images ago is downloaded today. It's silent on that, yet we all know this is a mega project which is coming. And so how would you judge its place in Sydney without a knowledge of how it might fit in transport? And again, to look into Sydney and to look at a very key lesson, this is the Royal Commission to Sydney of 1909. This is the summary plan. And like just about every submission, they proposed a city circle railway that was actually realised pretty well in this form, a few minor changes here and there. But those stations were built over the next 20 or 30 years by consolidated government action following the plan. But it was a very interesting commission because it was open to people to put forward ideas and submissions. And this is the great urbanist, rather pretty character apparently, John Sulman, but I think he had an extraordinary understanding of city making, and his were by far the boldest proposals. And key to his proposal was not just to make a city circle, he actually made a city figure eight, because what he proposed was a central line up George Street with two loops, one picking up the ridge of King's Cross, the other picking up the ridge of Piermont, and then all the other lines spinning off this central structure. And the reason he gave for that was that he said the city centre is very small and Sydney would soon outgrow it, and it needed to anticipate that through transport and build a bigger structure for the city centre through the transport, solving the problem of topography. That is the clearest statement that Sulman made then, and imagine if Sydney had done that in 1909, even though the city circle isn't a bad project per se. It doesn't have that dimension of time, which is critical in city making. And so when we compare central Sydney to other cities, and by coincidence I do have Copenhagen as one of them, Helen, these are to the same scale. And what you see, and this was done as part of Sydney 2030 with Rod, what you see is certainly the natural barriers, but in red are all the barriers we have made ourselves through infrastructure, through railways, through ports, through golf courses and other impediments to sensible urban form. But we can solve those problems because we've made them ourselves. We don't want to solve the problem of the harbour because it's our greatest asset, but we can still have projects that work with it, particularly in a formal way to interact with its topography. And also to compare New York. And so this was then to look at the number of linear kilometres of public transport. So within, you can see the area of central Sydney, 26 square kilometres. We had a pathetic 26 kilometres of fixed rail track. It thankfully is going up a little bit since that time, where many other cities had about 10 times that. And that just shows you the disinvestment in public infrastructure since the 1930s, since the Harbour Bridge was built, basically. So we certainly see a lot of problems, and problems we face every day in our work in terms of the priorities for the city and today's processes and priorities. One is the contemporary obsession with risk or de-risk, where you get these rather comical, you might have, maybe some of you haven't been exposed to these things, where you get severity and likelihood. And you get this matrix, and I think basically if you say the word risk, every government agency I know just goes panic and disarray. So I think that risk is actually one of the most venal methods that's in use today, because it's basically the death of opportunity. And so I think I've been to 5 risk workshops on different projects this year. I always say, I don't care about risk, tell me the opportunities. And the engineers are sort of petrified because they all know about risks, and the lawyers, you know, they all know about, well, risks and opportunity for them. But what risk does, thinking about the city as risk, means you kill the opportunities for genuine city making. It's a negative process. Death to risk. Cost-benefit analysis. I don't want to cut across what Mark is going to say, but let's just remind ourselves that we're actually one of the richest countries on the planet. Let's just remind ourselves that we've actually been one of the richest countries on the planet since about the gold rush. That's 1850, that's what, 165 years? And we're not exactly about to get poorer very quickly, though the lack of investment in critical national infrastructure is perhaps one of our Achilles' heels, as it perhaps is education. But we're not very highly taxed relative to that. And I guess Rod and I were in a talk the other day at the City of Sydney, and they're talking about, the problem of, Treasury's framing of this. I mean, you'd think we're poor. And, you go to a country like Korea and you see this massive investment in infrastructure and in people working and making things, not just flogging financial services off the top. They actually can do things. And I was reminded of, I don't read much economic statements, but E. Schumacher, the German economist who was obviously instrumental in starting the Green Movement. And he challenged directly this cost benefit, this is 1970 or so, to press non-economic values into the framework of the economic calculus. Economists use the method of cost-benefit analysis. This is generally thought to be an enlightened and progressive development, as it is at least an attempt to take account of costs and benefits that might otherwise be disregarded altogether. All it can do is to lead to self-deception or the deception of others. For to undertake them to measure the unmeasurable is absurd and constitutes but an elaborate method of moving from preconceived notions to foregone conclusions. All one has to do is obtain the desired results, is to input suitable values to the immeasurable costs and benefits. The logical absurdity, however, is not the greatest fault of the undertaking. What is worse and destructive of civilization is the pretense that everything has a price, or in other words, that money is the highest value of all. And we see this constantly also in the allied field of economic modelling, which is paraded across our media at every opportunity. And I'd just love to see a sort of post-occupancy evaluation of economic models 12 months down the track to see whether they've actually been even close to the mark. Let's take a concrete example. It's very concrete. The Anzac Bridge, it's in the Bays precinct. And why don't we benchmark it, which is another key current term, with the harbour bridge. What does this actually do? It's tall enough to allow one ship per year to get underneath it, which is why it was so high. It has 7 lanes of traffic and one 2.5 metre wide shared pedestrian cycleway, which is two-way and difficult to access, as the people who went on the bridge walked the other day. Let's compare it with the harbour bridge, built some 70 years earlier, which has currently 8 lanes of traffic. It has 2 mainline train lines. It has a cycleway separate from a pedestrian way. It has now a busway. As it was originally built by Bradfield, it had 6 lanes of traffic, 2 tram lines on the eastern side, which were reserved for the Northern Beaches railway line. So in terms of its transport ask, it does a lot more. In fact, it almost does more than any bridge I've ever seen in the world. Hard to think of too many that actually have so many modes combined. And of course, you can't think of Sydney without the Harbour Bridge, not only as this incredible presence in the city as this genius work of infrastructure, but in fact, what it's done is change Sydney, the whole city, by its scale, by its connection, by its qualities. And I think not only are all those things which are in cost-benefit analyses have, and I'm sure Marcus will give us plenty of reasons why they should be there, but the one that's always missing for me is time. Time. This was a project that was opposed by Treasury for decades in the 1920s, when Bradfield, that great advocate of progressive city making, was able to convince the public, and he was a public servant in the genuine sense of the word. And Sydney couldn't afford to build it in 1923 to 32, and it couldn't afford to build it again today if we adopted cost-benefit analyses. But you work it out retrospectively, and actually a great test of those methods would be to put a value on it now, apply that method now with the 80 years of benefit that Sydney's actually accrued from this piece of infrastructure, and then maybe we might see what's missing in terms of cost-benefit analyses. Of course, Glebe Island Bridge, or Anzac Bridge, would hugely benefited in a cost-benefit analysis if this bridge, the old Glebe Island Bridge, this is the third bridge, this is the second bridge, were to be brought back into use. Because then you could add pedestrians and cycles, you could add local traffic, you could add public transport, you could add connectivity at water level without that incredible disconvenience of coming up to this deck level, which is way too high. However, we find earlier this year there was in fact a cost-benefit analysis done of Old Glebe Island Bridge, and they're the people who did it. And they found that in fact on a cost-benefit ratio it was far better to have boats use the water and knock it down rather than actually keep this piece of infrastructure for the benefit of a Bays precinct that we all know is coming in whatever form it is. Now, again, it'd be interesting to apply that retrospectively to Pyrmont Bridge. And the ignorance of these methods is absolutely stymieing our city, and I guess this is what I can say and Helen can't as a working with the New South Wales government, and it is a point of freedom. And wouldn't it be good if the profession actually spoke up more about the city? So why don't we just compare things that are real, and why don't we actually change our methods based on things that are real and actually leave these pseudo-economic models to one side? But really what we're talking about is a failure of public imagination. And there isn't a week go by, this was in fact the week before last, when you might have missed it in the Herald, our Finance Minister, New South Wales Finance Minister, Dominic Perrottet, announced that they were trying to again flog the 3 sandstones along Bridge Street, the Lands Department, the Education Department and the Chief Secretary's building. And what he said in really one of the most remarkable quotes that I will continue to use, "It makes no sense to waste these sandstone buildings housing bureaucrats in prime CBD real estate." Well, if that's not absolutely the failure of public imagination, as well as an absolute slight on our public servants, imagine if a major corporation occupying those office buildings in the city, those shiny ones at Barangaroo, said that, look, our workers just aren't worth it. You know, why don't we put them in some, crap building because they're just not important enough to actually have any say. But what it also shows is an incredible ignorance of the city. The site of the Lands Department, in fact, all of those buildings on Bridge Street are on land that has been public land since 1788 and, of course, in Aboriginal sense, never had an ownership. These sites have been continuously used for public servants and services since 1788 when Governor Philip built the first houses for the Chief Justice and the like on these sites. The sites were renewed by Macquarie, who built new buildings, this one by Greenway on this site, and then they were renewed again after self-government in New South Wales in 1856, this one for the tremendously important function of regulating land in the state, and still a problem today in New South Wales, isn't it? This room in the middle was the plan room. In a sense, it's like the sort of storehouse of the public record. And I understand it, I've never been inside, that it's still intact. And then you can see how the bureaucracies actually ringed it. For me, it's a perfect, long-life, loose-fit, low-energy building. What it simply lacks is any investment and modernisation. It's been neglected for a lifetime, if not many lifetimes. But it is still one of the best buildings architecturally, I believe, that's ever been built in Sydney. It shouldn't just be flogged for a hotel, which is a suggestion, because people with $500 a night are more deserving than us, the public, who own it. But we also have, just down the road, the triumph of public imagination. And here you can see the power of it at work, taking a tram depot on the harbour, actually with a public space, keeping the public space all the way around the outside and building one of the great buildings, one of the great public buildings of the 20th century. And hard to think of a better public building, public place, a building that actually changes the city, the building that just embodies in every aspect of its design and siting a spirit of community life and community values. And of course, this is something that I've been fairly obsessed with a partner in crime, Peter John Cantrell, and have written a book on championing these public rights of the city and how this isn't a so-called CBD. This is actually the centre of our city. It's the political centre, the cultural centre, the social centre, the transport centre, the religious centre, the historic centre, the centre for events and visitations. It's what makes Sydney, Sydney. It isn't simply a site to exploit like mining, that it's you extract the highest dollar value. That is an incredibly negative way to think about a city centre. So just to finish, and again, trying to keep it contemporary here, that we do know a former Prime Minister died in the last week. So I thought one of the few Prime Ministers who's ever talked about the city from a policy perspective. And so from Whitlam's speech way back in 1965, public needs and public convenience must take priority over private property rights. It's a long time since any public figure said that. And maybe that's the problem with our democracy, is that our particular form of parliamentary democracy has become a cartel. And like so many aspects of an Australian society, you can think of airlines, supermarkets, trucking, just the list goes on, property development. We've become a cartel or a monopoly in some cases, usually a cartel. And that in fact democracy has in a sense failed to operate, and certainly democracy isn't championing enough public rights and public values. And so just to finish on Whitlam, on a project which is a great positive for Sydney, which is the changes to George Street. So the theme of this symposium reminds me of Aristotle's observation: men come together in cities in order to live. They stay together to live the good life. It's time we began solving, this is Whitlam's quote, solving the problems attendant on being the world's most urban nation. They will neither go away nor improve with neglect. Thank you.